Now we are entering into what I would consider the mid game of LaTale. Now remember that all of these phases of progression will change with each update. So the mid game is described as once you can solo all of the easy dungeons in the game. You can solo every dungeon in the game on easy mode. That is the first sign that you are in the mid game of LaTale. If you cannot solo every dungeon on easy mode, you are still an early game player, and there are some fundamental systems that you need to be focusing on, whether it is leveling up your account by making a lot of alts to get that extra EXP, whether it is leveling up your awakening and getting those stats and skills from the awakening system, or whether that is filling every slot of gear that you are capable of filling on your account and getting all those gear pieces to be the second best in slot. And it's essential that I say that. You are not in the mid game until you have gotten the second best in slot of each piece of gear, because once you have the second best in slot of each piece of gear and you have it maxed out for the most part, you are now looking at in-game content and focusing on the in-game loop. But until then, you are still an early game player who has not made the transition into the mid game. So what are some of the goals of a mid game player? Your goals are to finish your various long-term systems. So, getting your memorial flushed out, unlocking all your summonables, getting all your champion skills to level 10. This is mid game content. And now in current day and age, even getting your summons to level 10 could be considered mid-game content or in-game content. It's on the fence. Once again, awakening level, getting to level cap from the EXP spectrum is mid-game content now. Level cap is not that big of a deal anymore. It's going to give you a lot of stats and be a big benefactor in your gameplay, but it is not going to be the determining factor in how strong you are. It's just going to benefit you as you transition into in-game. So getting to level cap is mid-game content itself, as well as getting to awakening level 100 or so. Your focus in the mid-game is also to get minor stat increases, which essentially come from all the systems I've just covered, as well as awakening all of your second best in slot gear pieces so that they're at their full potential, or maybe re-rolling the stats or upgrading the pieces of gear to their greatest forms. As you can see here, I'm actually using advanced dark dragons armor and accessories, and I'm still capable of soloing all of the dungeons in the game on easy mode, right? Although I've spent a lot on the game, I've purchased a lot of pets through that early game journey. You can save up a lot of your ELI and purchase pets from other players, or get the pets from events that come very frequently, even different events like the special bonus coins, the event menu, and various events that come as you play the game. But generally speaking, you're going to start focusing on maxing everything out, right? I go to my reputation page. I have max base reputations, but as I get to some of these newer reputation systems, they're a lot lower level. Specifically speaking, the bounty hunter system, which can go up to level 50 now. I need to be doing that every day. I need to be getting and maxing out my Agasora gems, which I'll buy from other players or buy for myself if I'm a spender. I need to be in my illustration book trying to max out my title sets in this various ways depending on what systems they come from, maxing out my illustration book stats to the full extent possible without getting bored. Re-rolling my memorial stats to actual good stats that can benefit me in the long run, opposed to just having any stats on there. Actually re-rolling my runestone page to a page that can be viable for the end game. Leveling up my summonable skills to actually max them out so that they're as effective and as efficient as possible, as well as so that when they get to level 10 they can actually evolve to their next phase. And the mid game, I would say, is really the main stride of the game, where you'll feel what it's like to be in old LaTale. I'd say a lot of the early game is catching up. You're spending a lot of your time understanding these new systems and understanding the game's loops. But once you get into the mid game, it's going to feel like the old school LaTale progression, for the average person that got to probably level 180 plus or so back in the day. So the mid game is fairly simple. You get into a loop and you get into what feels like a daily gameplay. And in all honesty, I feel like when you get to the mid game, you're going to reach the point where it feels like you don't get rewarded as much for continuing to play, right? That's why I take a lot of breaks from the game fairly easily. I don't feel as motivated to play a lot because it's a lot of loop gameplay. I'm doing the same things every day just to increase my numbers. I'm not really getting too many new experiences, right? And that's how I really define the mid game. You don't get too many new experiences. Yeah, my numbers go up on a day-to-day basis because I'm adding a little bit more stats, and that's always cool. But in terms of experiences, not much changes. And this is at the point where I can really say I beat the game in terms of being able to solo all the dungeons on easy. I've beaten the playable content. Granted, the normal dungeons in the game are going to be a different experience when it comes to the way that the monsters interact, the way that the dungeon interacts, and the way that the bosses interact at the very end. But it's arguable as to whether or not that's really worth pursuing, depending on your lifestyle. But I will say many players don't get to the mid game because they don't understand a lot of the fundamentals of the game, whether that's either thinking, hey, LaTale's too easy now, so I'm not going to play at all, or hey, I got past the pregame, I got into the early game and I couldn't figure out how to progress, so I quit. It was just too hard to progress because I didn't understand how to get my stats higher. I didn't understand how to get to the next phase of gameplay. So a lot of people don't make it here, but the ones who do make it here, I would say, are pretty much a reflection of the loyal players of LaTale. And there are many players in the mid game. Even in my guild, which isn't very active, there are many players that are around my level, a higher level than me, and capable of soloing these in-game dungeons on easy, which is a reflection of the mid game and a reflection of LaTale's actual core community. And you can see this on the ranking leaderboard as well, where you'll see that we're getting close to 100 players being level cap or close to level cap. And then that only implies that there's a couple hundred players that are at least over 5,000 or at least having that mid game experience. But for the most part, there isn't too much else to talk about in the mid game. You're getting into a lot of loops. You're focusing on mastering your second best end slot gear, and you're making that transition into the actual end game. And I guess in the mid game, a general tip would be to focus on the lowest piece of in-game gear you have access to and actually flushing that piece of gear out and then moving to the next dungeon. And you can do that by making alternate characters and just running that dungeon every day to get as many pieces as possible, or just collecting those pieces over time and then working on upgrading those. And as you get that set piece or that piece of gear from that lower dungeon, you will start seeing big gains in your damage, and you'll be capable of soloing those dungeons on normal mode, which will continuously push you forward through the mid game and transition you into the end game. Now, finally transitioning into what I would consider LaTale's end game is very, very simple. LaTale's end game is defined by your ability or when you can solo the latest dungeon in the game. You can play this on your own, solo, whether that's with buffs or the various systems in the game to aid you in doing so. You can solo this dungeon, and your primary focus is making the best gear possible. LaTale's endgame is more tedious, less rewarding, and is going to be the longest stride of the game because it is endless. LaTale's endgame never ends. Every 3 months, a new piece of gear is going to be released that will add to LaTale's endgame and prolong what it means to be endgame. And the endgame players are going to spend 90% of their time online in these dungeons, these in-game dungeons, running them solo, normal, or rotating through characters, or maybe even running them with friends. But they're going to be focusing on getting as many pieces of in-game gear as possible so that they can go on enchanting sprees and try to make the best in slot statted piece of gear as possible. What's really important about this in-game piece, and this isn't for the in-game players because they don't really need this information, is that a lot of players in the mid game, a lot of players in the early game are going to attempt to pursue in-game gameplay, and that is going to hinder your LaTale experience because the in-game gameplay is not actually meant to be enjoyed from the same standpoint of adventure or rewarding progression. The in-game loop exists to give in-game players something to do. You put in your months, you put in your years, you put in so much money or effort or time into being an early game player, into being a mid game player. You're done. You've pretty much beat the game, but we don't want you to go. And so since we don't want you to go, we're going to make the process of best in slotting or creating the best in slot gear possible extremely long and tedious, to the extent of making enchant and upgrade rates that are less likely to reward you so that you can pursue them as long as possible, so that by the time you actually do complete this piece of gear, the next piece of gear will have released and now you have something else to do, keeping you in that loop so that the game stays alive and so that you can still feel like you are getting forward. And what's interesting about the end game is that a lot of end game players may be competing with one another to see who can get it first or to see who can be the strongest. But for the most part, the end game is as described. It's the end. So you can either accept that it's over and log off, or you can continue in the cycle of reaching the ultimate form you can be in the game as that ultimate form changes 3 months to 6 months later. And that's pretty much going to wrap up my understanding of LaTale's progression in 2023. Hopefully it wasn't too complex. Hopefully it wasn't too simple. Honestly, I approached this from the top of my head. I'm looking at this from the perspective of understanding where you are and what you should be focusing on. I didn't go too in depth with every system, and I did not go too in depth with how to get from point A to B. You know, some of these descriptions and definitions outline getting from point A to Z, you know, how to jump from A to Z, but they don't go in depth of how do I actually move from point B to C, point C to D, right? How does my day-to-day look as a pre-game player, as an early game player, specifically as a mid-game player? And that may be content for a later video, but hopefully in my pursuit to get older players who have not played LaTale in many years, or to get returning players who come back and feel overwhelmed, a idea of where LaTale is, hopefully I succeeded in that to whatever extent. And if I didn't, that's okay, because I will continue to pursue it as it is content. So that's going to wrap this video up. Once again, it's been your boy lemarss. Thanks for hanging out. Hopefully you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.